Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third retro seminar of this term. My name is Rita Mota, and I'm the Intesa San Paulo Research Fellow at the Oxford University Center for Corporate Reputation. With me today is Alan Morrison, Professor of Law and Finance here at the Saïd Business School in Oxford, who co-convenes Retro with me, and our guest speaker, Joanne Ciulla. Joanne is a professor of leadership ethics and the director of the Institute for Ethical Leadership at Rutgers Business School, and Professor Emerita at the Jepson School of Leadership Studies of the University of Richmond. Joanne is an incredibly distinguished scholar whose CV is too rich for me to do it justice in a short introduction, but I'll try to highlight some of the main points. Joanne is an expert on leadership ethics, business ethics, international leadership, and the philosophy of work, and she has published extremely important and impactful work, including a number of books and articles in leading journals. Joanne is on the editorial boards of Business Ethics Quarterly, The Leadership Quarterly, and Leadership, and she edits the New Horizons in Leadership Studies series. Joanne's incredible contribution to the field has been recognized in a number of honors and awards, including the Lifetime Achievement Award for Outstanding Contribution to Scholarship on Business Ethics from the Society for Business Ethics, and the Legacy Lifetime Achievement Award from the International Leadership Association. As you can probably tell, I am extremely excited and grateful to have Joanne with us today, and I'll turn the floor over to her in a moment, but before I do so, let me say a few quick words about the seminar. Many of you are regular attendees, and so you've heard much of this before, but for those of you who are here for the first time, let me give you some context. Retro, that is Reputation, Ethics, Trust, and Relationships at Oxford, is a seminar series that is concerned with the ethical and normative content of trust and reputation in organizational life. The seminar series started in January 2020, moved online about 2 years ago when the pandemic made in-person events impossible, and has been generously supported by the Center for Corporate Reputation since the beginning. Although many academic events are now back to an in-person format, Alan and I have decided to keep Retro online because this is the best way to continue to include people from all over the world. It is undeniable that having such a wonderfully diverse group of people in the virtual room makes for much more stimulating and wide-ranging discussions. So thank you for coming and for being part of this community. And I would also like to thank the people who make Retro possible. Rupert Younger, director of the CCR, who's always been supportive of this series in every possible way. Hannah Cooper, Chris Page, Mark Hughes Morgan, and Darius Jawa, who do all of the essential backstage work to make these seminars happen. And of course, Alan, whose knowledge and wisdom have been crucial to the existence and success of the series. Today's seminar addresses a question to which many of us wouldn't have given much thought until recently: why people accept leaders who act against their self-interests. This is a difficult question that comes with a very heavy emotional component. Western societies have witnessed in recent years an explosion in very public expressions of hatred, envy, and resentment. Of course, this is not a new phenomenon, but today's hyper-connected world, with social media platforms amplifying all sorts of messages that might otherwise not see the light of day, has become fertile ground for deeply polarized and inflexible political, religious, and cultural attitudes. Many commentators attribute this increased polarization and very vocal intolerance to the fact that populist leaders have been encouraging such attitudes, which many people might just have been repressing before those leaders came along and normalized them. Donald Trump's election and Brexit are but two examples of this widespread phenomenon. In cases like these, leaders persuade their followers that anything that the opposing camp thinks is actually wrong, and dialogue becomes extremely difficult. Joanne is going to shed light on this type of phenomenon by deploying the notions of resentment and ressentiment, and she will discuss the inversion of values that resentment generates. In short, she will help us to understand some very harmful contemporary leaders and the implications of their behavior. This is a much needed analysis, which I suspect will attract a lot of questions and comments, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing Joanne's thoughts. Joanne will speak for around 20 to 30 minutes. After that, we will have some time for questions and answers. Most of you already know how this works. Please enter your questions and comments into the Q&A box, not the chat, and either Alan or I will relay them to Joanne. You can find the Q&A button either at the top or the bottom of your screen, depending on the device that you are using. We're going to finish promptly at 5 p.m. as usual. Joanne, thank you so much for being here today. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Rita. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I loved your introduction because you anticipate a lot of the work that I've been doing since Resentment. So maybe great minds think alike. Anyway, this is part of a series of papers that I've been writing. And now I'm about to write a book on the moral history of leadership. And I've been looking a lot at trying to understand this phenomena we've seen in the world, as Rita said, starting with Brexit and Trump and things like that. And in particular, I look back, and if you remember, it wasn't that long ago that Francis Fukuyama wrote a book called The End of History, The First Man, and he seemed to think that the world was just about getting it right. Freedom and democracy was on the roll, everything was looking wonderful, and maybe the world was really going to be right. And then a whole lot of things happened, including the election of Donald Trump, where everyone stepped back and said, hey, wait a minute. You know, we thought globalization was great. We thought all these things were wonderful. And then we started to see the emergence of a variety of leaders who seemed to go against all of the progress that many people thought we were making in the world. So I'm going to start with, I'm going to put up my slides, and we're going to talk a little bit about resentment. So let me get here. All right. So if you look at this cast of characters on the screen, they all look familiar. I started with certainly Putin, Hugo Chavez, obviously Trump, Bolsonaro from Brazil. Some of the people aren't in office. Marine Le Pen would fall into this category. I could have added Prime Minister Modi of India. These are a variety of Netanyahu, who's now out of office, but these are a variety of leaders that have in some way used aspects of resentment for the kind of power they yield. Now, everybody likes to call them populists, and I don't think populist is quite appropriate for some of these leaders. They're not really populists. Some of them are more like the Greek ideal of demagogues, but this notion of resentment is a very rich notion, and I came upon 3 books. I'll hold them up, you can see them in the little one. Well, certainly Nietzsche, who I've read for years. Then a book by a friend of mine, Ruth Capriles, on resentment. She wrote this for my series in 2007, and that book is on Hugo Chavez. And then this is the main book I'll be talking about, which is by Max Scheler. All right, so here are these leaders who seem to go against democratic ideals, seem to go against sort of the course of history that Fukuyama thought was so wonderful, this kind of Hegelian synthesis that had brought everyone together. But let's dig into what I'm trying to argue here is that as I looked at these leaders emerging, and as I looked at the emergence of Donald Trump, and since then a whole lot of leaders like him in America and other places, one of the things I was trying to understand was there was no rationality to a lot of it. Couldn't make sense out of it. And realized as I started to watch Trump rallies, which is not a pleasant experience, that there was a lot of emotion involved, that this wasn't really about reason. It wasn't something you made sense of in a rational way. It was about huge amounts of emotion that circumvented reason. Now, along with this, as Rita indicated, we also, some people argue we're in a post-truth world, but truth seemed to disappear, and so did logic. So both of those things, facts about things, didn't seem to matter as much. What seemed to matter was how people felt. And in particular, what was that feeling? And that's where Nietzsche and my friend Ruth Capriles and Schiller were extraordinarily helpful. So let's look at what some of these philosophers said about it. Now I have two words. I have the French word and the English word, resentment and ressentiment. And we'll see that the French word has a richer background, which is what we want to look at. So if we look at resentment in the English sense of the word, it's about indignation, a perceived wrong, a kind of rancor that people have about something that has been bad. Now, not everybody thinks resentment is a negative emotion. For example, Adam Smith and David Hume both made the point that resentment is kind of an important emotion because it makes us demand justice. So if somebody wrongs you, you may feel resentment and badly about that wrong, but it also may make you want to pursue justice. This is a somewhat rosy positive view of it. Adam Smith actually has some passive aggressive notions of resentment. Smith says resentment, the only one of the ways to cure it is not just justice, but when people apologize. So if someone wrongs you, they say, I'm sorry. But he says also resentment includes the desire to humiliate the person who did something wrong to you. So there's something really nasty and passive aggressive about this notion. There's this desire to humiliate is an interesting one. Now, the French term ressentiment is very profound in that it literally means a re-feeling. And what I want to get at is how powerful this emotion is. So you re-feel the perceived wrong or grievance over and over. Resentment feels good. It's a little like Schadenfreude. The notion of pleasure, taking pleasure in someone else's pain. The difference between the two is that Schadenfreude is an emotion that is topical. It has to do with incidents. Resentment, the thing that makes it so powerful and why the French term really captures it is because it's long-term. It's a delicious emotion. It's a hungry emotion. It likes to be fed. So I would watch rallies, Trump rallies, and what you would see is what he was giving them. He was giving them the feeling. He was feeding this wonderful emotion, the grievances, trying to humiliate the people they resented and the things they resented. So resentment has phenomenal amount of power. And that's what I found most interesting about it. And I suspect it's one of the reasons politicians today, not just in America, have found it a winning formula for winning elections. Now, there's going to be some social conditions that are the obvious reason why we have this resentment now, why resentment works so well, but I'll get to that in a minute. In 2007, Ruth Capriles wrote a book for my New Horizons series, and she wrote a book about Hugo Chavez. And he's one of the first in this sort of course of leaders who cultivates resentment, but he's in a much more traditional form because he takes this sort of socialist Marxist view of society. So here he creates a kind of class resentment. And as Capriles says, there's a kind of mirroring effect of leaders. So what Chavez did in Venezuela that was so destructive was he mirrored the resentment for classes, but he also gave a kind of permission to get your pound of flesh from those who have and the have-nots. And that's the other part of resentment, is obviously there's going to be people that you resent are going to be the haves and have-nots. So we're going to see social and economic inequality is a very, very big factor in resentment. So Chavez cultivated this, and one of the things that came out of it that was extremely dangerous was there was a kind of permission to attack those who you resented. So there was a lawlessness in society. It became extremely dangerous. People were kidnapped for ransom. People were robbed blatantly in the streets. And so this was a very, very dangerous thing. And as she points out, resentment is a kind of anesthetic. People are feeling pain. They're hurting for various reasons. So the deliciousness of resentment is part of this anesthetic. But the person who really sort of is the gold standard for understanding resentment is Friedrich Nietzsche. So if we look at Nietzsche in many ways, he kind of hits the nail on the head. He tells us the despicable man is coming, somebody who can't despise himself. And he goes on and he says something that's very relevant to politics today. The fact that there's noble morality comes from affirming things. It comes from the yes. So we think of some leaders who their strength comes from the fact that they want to make achievements, they want to make life better, they want to say yes to a better life, to a kind of flourishing. Whereas the slave morality that Nietzsche talks about is the no. It's the no to the outside. It's the no to the other, the non-self. No is its creative act. So politicians who grapple with resentment and use it as a tool have a lot of things that they can have people say no to. I mean, one of the factors that's affect in many countries where they have these leaders is immigration. The idea of the other, the outside, saying no to them, resenting them, worrying that they're going to take something away from you. This part of resentment we see in many places, but it's this negative notion. And of course, Nietzsche looked at it as resentment as a problem of modernity, a social and moral problem of modernity. He said he saw European society, he said it lacked passion, it was complacent, it was apathetic, and people were mainly concerned with their individual desires and interests. Sound familiar? He said they no longer had to fight for freedom, equality. They didn't want to feel like they needed to strive for anything great. He called people who lived under this condition, this kind of person, the resentful man. So we get these very dramatic terms in Nietzsche: slave morality, the last man, the resentful man. And we see this in Zarathustra, and we see it in the genealogy of morals. But his description of society is pretty spot on for what we're looking at today. Again, maybe this is a 100-year phenomenon, I'm not sure. And he says of slave morality, he says they can't let go of victimhood. They're forever dwelling in real or imagined aggression or pain that made them the victim. And we notice with leaders, some leaders like Trump, they're victims. They're always victims. They're victims of the elites. They're victims of whomever. And he says, he has a great phrase. He says, people like this, their souls squint and their spirits love hiding places, secret paths and back doors. So he says, but the problem, again, that Nietzsche hits right on the head is he says, the thing about the resentful man, unlike the noble man, excuse my use of man, but that's what Nietzsche says. Unlike the noble man, the resentful man, he's not dumb. As a matter of fact, he says, the resentful man is bound to be cleverer than any noble race. And the revolt of the slaves will lead to the reign of the last man, which will be one of mediocrity, corruption, and political nihilism. We can see that in some of the characters that I showed you on the first screen. So this notion of nihilism, this notion of mediocrity, affirms many of the phenomena that we've seen in societies. Now, Nietzsche is someone who certainly inspired Scheler, Max Scheler. Now, Max Scheler, if you're not familiar with him, he's a really interesting philosopher. You know how in some fields like music or comedy, there's the musician's musician or the comedian's comedian. Scheler was the philosopher's philosopher of his day. Many philosophers thought he was just one of the great philosophers. Many of us don't read him anymore, but I strongly recommend that you do. He's an interesting guy because he was a Jew who converted to Catholicism and he became a very devout Catholic in Germany right before the rise of Hitler. So here's a picture of Max. Now, Max Scheler wrote this book on resentment, and he was really talking about his own times. And he describes resentment as a self-poisoning, a refeeling of negative emotions, impotence. And impotence is a very important part of this picture, that people feel helpless because of historical forces, social forces, or whatever. And they have a weakness, and they're constantly engaged in social comparison, comparing themselves to others. Now, when we think, again, going back to inequality as one of the factors that affects us, immigration, inequality are going to be two important factors that lead to the rise of resentment. When we think of what that's like, a lot of people in America, for example, and probably in the UK, were left behind by globalization and feel helpless. Other people zoomed ahead of them. That's where the inequality came, and they seem to be thriving in it. And there's a clash between these two notions that politicians cultivated. And it's not necessarily political nihilism in the real sense of the word, but it's political nihilism when we look at the question of whether it was leadership for the greatest good of everyone, because cultivating resentment is not good for anyone. But what Scheler says about resentment is, he says it's most likely in societies that have, and he says, approximately equal rights, political and otherwise, or formal social equality that's publicly recognized. So in democratic societies, because the other big question we have to ask is what's happening to democracy? But in democratic societies, people expect to have some level of equality. Certainly we don't expect to be the same, but some kind of level of equality. And yet we've seen a growing difference in power, property, and education. So he describes resentment as a psychological dynamite that spreads with social and political inequality. Another factor of this dynamite, of course, is the world changes, it leaves some people behind. And what politicians and leaders cultivate is a kind of nostalgia for the lost golden age. The golden age can be anything from the age when white men ran the world and women served them. It can be when a country had an empire that ruled the world. It can be when there was a Soviet Union. We could name all sorts of images that leaders today have of this golden age, of this lost world. Now, the other thing about this, so there's a nostalgia, and with that, of course, comes the grievance for what is lost. And the grievance is something that some political leaders, and Trump was very good at that. It's like a scab that you keep picking. They try to keep cultivating it again and again and again. Now, Scheler went on to talk about, well, what kind of leaders emerge under these conditions and are able to successfully use resentment. And of course, the leaders themselves have a level of resentment. And he says there's two types of people who have resentment. The first is the weak variety, and they're the ones who are just impotent and don't really do anything. And then he says there's the energetic variety of men of resentment, and he calls them the Arriviste. And the Arriviste is similar to Nietzsche's last clever man. And you'll have to excuse my indulgence of this picture here, but look at this description. It is, when I first read this, I got goosebumps, because here's a guy writing in 1914, and he says, a person who incessantly tries to arrive at the top, outdoing his fellow persons at any cost, unable to love, to give, to forgive, to sacrifice, to admit defeat with his head up, to make friends, to be content with his own self. He's impotent to enjoy the value and quality of his life. He's good at smirking rather than smiling in friendship. So not all of the leaders I pointed out fit this description, but it certainly was a description that seemed to be written for someone like Trump. But what we also see is, because politicians after someone like Trump recognized, though they may not have identified it, the power of resentment, they've cultivated some of these same behaviors and same grievances. The irony of these people, as we'll see, is that in some ways, they're definitely not populists. In America, we see the emergence of a number of leaders who have Ivy League educations, who have taken on the positions and the attitudes of a Trump, including that he did not lose the last election, because they found it such a successful political tool. But we can't just talk about resentment in one group of people, because we have to consider the resented. There's two sides to this equation. It's not like one side got it right and one side got it wrong. So here we have the key resented person, Hillary Clinton, on the top, who actually articulated in the clearest way why we have a whole segment of society that resents elites, when she said that there was a basket of deplorables. Well, that's exactly the emotion that these people are reacting against. So the people left behind think that the other half, the elites, see them as deplorables. And apparently some of them do. What's interesting about it is that I put up Anthony Fauci, because with resentment, not only was the resented elites, but we'll see they resent science, they resent the media, they resent a whole number of both institutions and people and classes of people. We also see divisions in a lot of countries between big cities and rural people because of what the economy has done to their lives and how they see the world. So there's a lot of blame to go all around for the resented. And Hannah Arendt, in The Origins of Totalitarianism, she says resentment is a last remnant of humanly understandable feeling. So she's obviously talking about Nazi Germany. But what she says is that early on, a lot of the guards in concentration camps resented the Jews, resented that they had been well off, they had been well educated, etc. She said that was the last remnant of human feelings, because after the most despicable thing, the most evil thing, according to Arendt, is when there's no more resentment, that these people are just invisible. They're no longer seen. And so in society, what I think has happened with leaders is that there had been this whole group of people who were simply not seen. They weren't seen, they weren't heard, their feelings weren't considered. And along comes a leader who appears to see them, appears to share in their grievance, and all of a sudden they begin to feel. And the feeling is this powerful and somewhat enjoyable feeling of resentment. So it's an interesting and complicated set of issues in terms of the emotion. But here's where it gets really interesting, is it helps to explain, this emotion helps to explain why leaders have people go against, why people pick leaders who go against their self-interest. And here we can see a lot of supporters going back to someone like Trump. He was telling them about policies that would actually hurt them enormously. Whether those policies, for example, getting rid of the healthcare bill. Many of his followers are quite poor people who really needed to have healthcare through that bill. So how did that happen? And the way to explain that is the inversion of values, which we get in Nietzsche, but also what Scheler calls value blindness. And the best way to understand the inversion of values is from Aesop's fable, the sour grapes. Some of you may know this. So here's a wolf, and it's a hot summer day, and he's very thirsty. And so he goes and he's walking along and he sees these delicious, juicy grapes hanging. But the grapes are just hanging too high. And he jumps and he jumps and he cannot reach the grapes. And so he finally gets frustrated and he says, oh, well, they were probably sour anyway. So what was good and would be wonderful for him, all of a sudden he sees as bad. And we can see this as a metaphor for how a lot of the values, especially those related to democracy, have become inverted. Just heard on the news the other day, someone running for governor in the gubernatorial primary in Pennsylvania, one of his campaign promises is that he is going to make a law so that he can overturn elections. And this apparently is a selling point. Well, when we think of democracy, the one thing we want are free and fair elections. The idea of voting someone in who can overturn elections and have the power to overturn elections seems like a complete inversion of values. Science, that's why I put Fauci up. So you have science that gave a lot of conflicting information about COVID, frustrates people to the point where they say, no more science. Science doesn't know what they're doing. Science isn't valuable. And many of them, people make fun of this idea, I'll do my own research. So what comes out of resentment is this inversion of values. What we thought was bad is now good, and what we thought was good is now bad. I could give you lots of examples of that, but we want to have some time for discussion. So lastly, the question is, so what do we do about it? Well, Bishop Butler once said, forgiveness is the forswearing of resentment, but I don't think it's going to be that easy. Initially, when I started this study, I thought that by not feeding resentment, it might fade. So if we got rid of Trump, and then I was delighted when he could no longer be on Facebook or Twitter, I thought, oh, well, that might help things a bit. But what I didn't foresee, and I've been wrong about a lot of things in this, was the fact that there were going to be other people who realized that harnessing this would be a great way to build a political future. So we have new people cultivating resentment, and the story continues on. In Schiller's day, you had 2 world wars, which seems to have fixed some of the problems. I'm not sure what's going to happen today with this. Between the magical dreams of Vladimir Putin and the resentment he's cultivated about the West and others, it's hard to see where the end is in sight. But let's hope that, like at the beginning of the 20th century, in the next 100 years, it will go away and people will get back to treating each other well. But I think it starts with both sides of understanding why people feel resentment, or why you can cultivate resentment in them, and seeing them and beginning to do things. So the resenters have as much work to do as those who resent. So with that, I will stop, and happy to have some discussion.
Thanks, Joanne. That was absolutely fascinating. This is such an important topic. As I said at the beginning, I think it's crucial that we try to understand it a little bit better. And you did wonderfully there, just making it clearer for us. I would just like to remind all of our attendees that they can put their questions and comments into the Q&A box, and Alan or I will relay them to Joanne. But before we get there, I have a question of my own. I'm very interested in the role of social media in all of these processes of cultivating resentment, and perhaps supporting leaders in using resentment for their own purposes. Would you share some thoughts on that? What do you think the impact of social media has been in this type of phenomenon, and what can social media companies do to try to prevent this sort of thing from happening, or from being so severe?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's fine. I'm smiling because I just wrote an essay on this, because this is actually the next step. So again, I don't know, you're reading my mind, or I'm reading your mind, one of the two. But yeah, so if we look at social media, I mean, here's the other great irony of our day, is that one of the issues, going back to someone like Plato, who didn't like the idea of democracy because he thought most people were too dumb, didn't have enough information to make good choices, is in the information age. I wrote a paper called Leadership in the Age of Emotion, that instead of the age of reason or enlightened citizens, we have the opposite in some ways. So the social media companies have certainly made the problem worse in some respects, because when you democratize information and then people can consume it at will, what happens is people get the information, but they don't see necessarily how it's produced. So it's very often by who it's produced by. So people only watch media that's by them. Then the question becomes, well, do these people do harm? Well, you know, we can listen to all sorts of stories about things and it doesn't necessarily harm us. But I think the problem right now is who should be moderating this? Should it be government regulation, or should it be media companies themselves? And so far, I'm at a standstill. I mean, there was just a ruling today in the courts that said that they were trying to keep social media companies from monitoring speech. This was in Texas, of course, and by people who want to be able to put just anything on social media. What's interesting, though, is will those same people want to put just anything on social media if they don't like it? And that is the question. So I think that social media has created even more emotions because you can get your feelings fed there. And people tend to only look at things that support their own opinions on both sides of the coin. But yeah, social media is a really big part of this. And I don't think Trump could have actually done this as well, because if you remember when he was president, every single day it was fed and they got their fixes. And now you have Trump wannabes who are doing some of the same things.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Ellen?
Thanks, Geeta. Thanks for a really fascinating talk. I have a kind of conceptual question. I'm thinking about literature that suggests that, and some of the time, emotional responses can be quite informative and they can be an aid to cognition. They can teach you something useful. They can even, in the case of reactive emotional attitudes, they can even teach us something useful emotionally. And I guess I have a bunch of related questions to raise. One is that ever true of resentment? And secondly, I have the strong impression that it probably a lot of the time isn't, and that resentment isn't necessarily informative in the way that some other affective states are. You described it as, Scheler describes it as a self-poisoning of the mind. And if that's the case, presumably it doesn't actually teach us something, it clothes something from us. And does that clothing, is it, so relatedly, do I really self-poison, or do I get together with a group and engage in a sort of Orwellian group hate so that we collectively poison our minds? So I guess there are three parts to that question. Pick the bit you want to talk about.
Well, I think what Scheler tries to get at, he says it's self-poisoning. I think what he tries to do is keep free will in the mix. And so you can decide to do it. But your question is very insightful, because there's a point where you can't decide anymore. So take one aspect of resentment, which is grievance. And so I read a lot of the psychoanalytic material on grievances. And part of what psychologists try to do if you're in therapy is they want you to get rid of the grievance. Because if you keep the grievance, in a way, you're still ill in some respect, right? So it can be informative. I mean, what Smith is trying to say is it's informative in that it makes you demand justice. And so that's an informative emotion. But the problem is, and the reason why the French term is so important, is it's kind of insatiable.
When you demand justice, so you're not experiencing something more like outrage than resentment. But I wonder if the effective state that demands justice is really resentment. You know, if I start feeling resentful towards people who are poorer than me, who've historically been very disadvantaged, I don't think I'm demanding justice, am I?
Oh, no, not necessarily. And so that's what Smith thought it was. He said it was a feeling that led to justice. But again, then he turns around and says, that's what's so weird about the passage. Then he turns around and says, yeah, but it's not just justice you want to humiliate those people. So there's a kind of revenge part in it too. So I don't think, see, justice in theory would put an end to it. And the problem with resentment is it doesn't necessarily end. And I couldn't find, here's, maybe some of you know this, I couldn't find literature that talked about, I saw stuff on grievance, which I thought would be useful in terms of what do you do to end grievance in people. But I couldn't find anything that talked about resentment. So more work to be done.
We have a lot of questions in the Q&A, so I should give some other people a chance. Rita.
Okay.
Thanks. There are a couple of questions here that I think are very closely related. Vivek is asking if resentment could be used by leaders for something that's good. Maybe people who are persecuted and who have a leader that uses resentment to spur much needed revolution. And in a similar context, Jose Alarcon is asking if you could perhaps think about leaders using resentment in the context, for example, of Me Too or Fridays for Futures. You know, there's definitely quite a lot of negative emotion involved, for example, in environmentalism, resentment against groups of people who polluted too much and are not taking control, taking responsibility and doing enough at the moment. And young people have justifiable negative emotions towards people older than them, older generations, previous generations. Do you think that we could still think in terms of resentment? And if so, could it be that the leadership that harnesses resentment might not always be harmful?
Well, I mean, perhaps we could go back to Marx. I mean, he is a great class consciousness. The fact that, you know, if you want to get rid of the dictatorship of the proletariat, you've got to have class consciousness, and you have to resent the fact that the capitalist is using your labor and not giving you enough for it, not being fair to you and bossing you around. So yes, you can use it to cultivate emotion, but environmentalists who are mad at polluters, that's not necessarily resentment. Resentment is a personal grievance. It's someone who's offending and humiliating you. Environmentalists, you can be mad at those people. You can dislike them. You could be prejudiced against them, but they're not doing it to you. It's not this feeling.
Well, they kind of are, and you know, they kind of are. And there's a recent study where they surveyed a very large number of children and young people around the world precisely about climate change and how they feel about it. And there's quite a lot of anger, and they feel that their lives are being ruined or made a lot more difficult precisely because of what people who came before them did to the world and the environment. So I'm not entirely sure I would rule out that sort of personal injury side of things.
Is it going to be a refeeling though? So the big difference is that there's an end game there. So you hate the people who pollute. Maybe you resent them because they're doing harm to you, just like you resent people who won't wear a mask, right? But there's an end game to those. And that is that they either go out of business or you fix the environment or the person puts on the mask. The difference is with resentment, there's no end game. It continues on because it's your own hurt, whereas the other ones aren't. So that's what's so tricky. I mean, so I could spend hours on just the conceptual analysis of this to sort of see where those gradations are. But again, is it something they want to feel over and over? Do they enjoy feeling that? I don't think an environmentalist enjoys feeling mad at people who are polluters. I maybe they do. I don't know.
Probably not, but right. Okay. Thank you, Ellen.
We have a question in the Q&A from Julian Friedland, who's asking about business leadership. And I think there's a sort of general question about organizational contexts here. So I wonder if it's possible for an organization to foster resentment amongst the people who work in it, and for that to be definitive of something about the organization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, And there are actually organizational theories that sort of account for some of this. But social comparison can create a kind of resentment. Two-tiered class systems in an organization where it's very clear who's the valuable people and who aren't the valuable people. Generally not treating people with the respect. Again, this
I guess that's something that that's resentment within the organization. I was thinking about an organization that resents something about the rest of the world. So you make the organization the us, and you make the them someone else, and you make that one of the things that contours the organization.
I think you're veering towards like a Greenpeace kind of notion, so that so if you have a cause in your organization, you could resent people who are contrary to your cause. But I'm not sure it would have, within the organization, you could have it, because it has to be in a social context. It has to be in a context where in theory, everybody should be equal, but they're not treated equal, and they actually aren't equal in a broader political sense, not in the literal sense of being the same. So I'm not sure how that would work, actually. Maybe you have some examples. I would love to hear.
I can think of some political parties in which people are united by their resentment of someone else or something else, or many of your examples look like that. And those, to some extent, in some political parties, those attitudes have started to constitute a form of group intentionality. And when you join the organization, you have to buy into it.
Right.
That therefore suggests that the capacity to build that sort of group intentionality might be a form of leadership.
Yeah, I mean, well, we all know that having a common enemy is a great way to bind people together.
Well, that's not the same as resenting, right?
No, it's not at all the same as resenting. Because resenting, again, it's both a public and a private and a personal thing that happens. So it's something that you're in a social context. Leaders have a huge influence. They can cultivate it in you, but they only can cultivate it in you if there's something else in you, in your context already. And that's where things like inequality and notions of supposed equality in a culture are going to matter. Or even things like fear of illegal aliens, fear of equal rights. I mean, we could say that there are probably groups of men that have huge amounts of resentment for women, for people who don't conform to gender types or whatever. So there's a whole lot of things with the other that continue. So, and it's always a zero-sum game too. I mean, it's always that if you're giving privilege or trying to lift up or trying to accept one group, that it harms you in some way.
Okay, I have a lot more, but there's so many questions I'm going to hand back to Rita.
Thank you. There's a question here from Sebastian Voss that also is aligned with something that I was thinking about. So Sebastian is asking about leaders possibly engaging in sense making and sense giving with their followers to transform the emotions that were at the origin of resentment, and to turn it into something quite different. Do you think that this would be possible? I mean, many of the examples that we've been discussing and that you presented, if I think about them, I almost think that the people who were left behind, like you were saying, might not even listen to a leader that tried to do that type of exercise with them. What are your thoughts about this?
Well, this is the big question that's been tormenting me, because how do you even begin that conversation? So if you take some theories like transformational leadership, how do you begin to transform it? Well, transformational leadership is, if you go back to transforming leadership, James McGregor Burns's work, not Bernie Bass's work necessarily, but Burns's work, he says what transformational leadership is about is engaging in a dialogue about your values. Now, your question is, practically, can we do that? When I talk to my colleagues who are Habermasians in Europe, they have great faith in dialogue. In my part of the world, I'm not sure about it. What I think, my hunch at this point in time, and again, I'm wrong about a lot of things, is that you have to start fixing the pathologies, the social pathologies behind it. And that is a beginning. So it gets to the resented, a beginning of acknowledging what the problems are that have made these people so fertile for resentment. How do we begin? You know, if you look in America right now, we have what are called deaths of despair. 1 million people have died from overdoses of opioids, mainly, largely in the Rust Belt, places where people have lost their jobs and never been able to get good jobs again. This is a rather serious problem. These are not your stereotypes of drug addicts. These are people with families who had normal, everyday middle-class type existences who are overdosing on drugs like crazy. And you look at them, you say, well, what's going on with these people? Well, that's not going to involve a dialogue. That's going to involve addressing some real social problems. And what's happening right now is that, at least in our country, you can't get much done on the kinds of grassroots problems that need to be fixed, to perhaps get people too busy to worry about it. I mean, the thing about Trump is he makes people feel. They feel when he's around. And that's because they need something in their lives to feel. If we get them busy with jobs that engage them, with being able to, you know, buy a new house, to be able to support their children well, to go on vacation. There's a lot of things that people could spend their time doing except, you know, obsessing over these things. So it involves real social change. It involves real social programs. Just having a dialogue, I don't think is gonna happen. So there's gonna have to be shifts in power. And those are the broader political issues that we face.
Mhm. Thank you. Alan?
So there are two related questions, one from Athol Williams and one from Majid, which get at a conceptual question I think is sort of interesting. So Athol points out that people in business don't typically resent their competitors, but they often resent whistleblowers, say. And Majid points out that there's literature by people like Trevino saying that shame causes resentment and guilt does not. Is there something conceptual here? Is resentment often associated with feelings that are justified but make you feel bad about yourself? So is that a fair comment, or is that too broad a statement?
No, it can be. So if somebody does something that shames you or humiliates you, you may, and maybe they do it because you deserved it. They caught you with your hand in the till or something.
Yeah.
So if the person who catches you, one reaction to that is that they've humiliated you, even though you've done something wrong, but you may decide to keep reliving that grievance. You may want to get back at them. You may decide it's all people, let's say it's a manager, it's all the management. Or it may be, maybe it was a woman or a man who did it, and it's all the women in my organization. Maybe it was a minority.
Is there a perceived,
generalize it?
if you catch me with my hands in the till,
yeah,
and you call me out on it, I can't possibly perceive that as a wrong, can I?
Mm-hmm.
Is what's wrong here? The object of our discussion is my hand in the till. I have to accept that's a fact. Mm-hmm. So the wrong I experienced is some subjective way I experience you. Mm-hmm. So is this because you're calling me out, whereas someone who looked and sounded like me were calling me out, I wouldn't resent it? I mean, is this about the nature of the messenger rather than the nature of the object of the message?
Okay. Yeah, well, first of all, hand in the till is probably not a good example.
So whistleblowing is a good example. I think it's a very good example.
But no, it is about you in relation to some other. It is about that relationship, certainly, regardless of the facts, though.
Yeah.
It's what you decide that other has done or what that other that is, And very often you generalize out from it. So it's not, again, incidental. It's something broader than that incident.
Okay, we're almost out of time. Rita, do you think we have time for a quick one or not?
Maybe we have time for one more. David Silver is saying there are business opportunities in feeding resentment and business costs in resisting it. And David's wondering if you have any thoughts about the responsibilities of business leaders with respect to the culture of resentment in society.
Yeah, well, first of all, I would love an example of what those business opportunities are. But yeah,
Hats.
what?
MAGA hats.
MAGA hats. Okay, but but Trump makes the profit off of those. So, but yeah, so there's business opportunities and T-shirts and things that people sell at rallies.
David says Fox News.
Fox News is a whole other issue, isn't it? But those sorts of things, yes, they're business opportunities, but often the people who engage in those believe in them as well. So they're part of the crew. If they didn't believe in them and they were selling them, then it would raise some interesting questions about, the value of, would you sell anything to anyone just because people like it? And that's a broader business ethics question that we
can address in 2 minutes. Yes. Joanne, thank you so much for this fascinating seminar. I want to apologize to everyone whose questions and comments we didn't get to, but I promise that Joanne is going to receive all of them, so they're not lost. And I'd also like to use this last minute to advertise the next event. It will be the fourth and last seminar of this term. It's in a couple of weeks on the 15th of June at the same time. And we're going to have with us Jeremy Moon from Copenhagen Business School. And Jeremy is going to be speaking about corporate social responsibility and government, the role of discretion for engagement with public policy. So please do sign up if you haven't already. And I hope to see many of you here again in 2 weeks. And Joanne, thank you again for this. It was really, really great.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Bye.